I'm going to give a relatively short lecture on Sir Arthur Evans this evening, but one thing that I have done is I've brought along a number of books which you can have a look at afterwards if you're interested. I didn't bring along the 6 volumes of the Palace of Minos that Arthur Evans published, but rather more accessible books which are, you can buy most of them probably through Amazon or one of these places. But I just thought I would point these out as we start with the guidebook to the Palace of Minos by John Pendlebury, who was curator in the late 20s, early 30s. Very good book on KNOSSOS. Joan Evans's book on the Evans family. She was Evans's half-sister. So it's not only on Sir Arthur Evans, but it's on the whole family. Then Anne Brown of the Ashmolean Museum produced actually 3 books. These are 2 of them with terrific pictures on Evans before and during his excavations at Knossos. Sandy McGillivray, who was curator and also assistant director of the British School, he wrote this in-depth study of Sir Arthur Evans, attempting to look at his apparent darker side. My own book on Knossos for the Folio Society. It was interesting when I started on this, we realised, in fact, there was no concise book on Knossos at all, except the guidebook of the 1930s by John Pendlebury. So this was published in 2005. And then Yanis Nefis produced a book on Knossos with terrific photographs, and translated by me, in fact, so Greek and English. This is well worth it. And a very interesting book by the Knossos Conservation Group at Ariadne Museum, which covers the modern conservation works. I'll be talking about Evans's conservation works a bit, but this covers the more recent conservation works carried out by the Knossos Conservation Office, with, again, terrific plans and drawings and photographs. And then finally, the most recent book is The Aegean World, published by the Ashmolean, which I'll mention in my lecture. Sir Arthur Evans is best known as the pioneer excavator of prehistoric Knossos in Crete and the so-called Palace of Minos. However, he came late both to Crete and to systematic excavation, having spent the first half of his life as a journalist and political activist abroad, antiquarian and archaeologist. How does this work? Am I being stupid? Oh, it doesn't matter, I'll just use this. Dead? Okay. Right, there we are. Okay. So, Evans was the son of John Evans, later knighted, and Harriet Ann Dickinson, whose wealth was based on a successful paper mill. His mother died when he was 7, and his father went on to marry twice more, the third wife, a classical scholar, giving birth to a daughter, Joan, who became an art historian and wrote a penetrating biography of the Evans family entitled Time and Chance. John's interests in numismatics, geology, and archaeology led him to become a Fellow of the Royal Society, as well as President of the Society of Antiquaries and the Numismatic and Geological Societies. John's activities had a profound effect on his son, Yet when Arthur left Harrow School to go to Brasenose College, Oxford, he chose to study modern history, in which he gained a first. During his time at Oxford, Arthur travelled in France, Germany, the Carpathians, Lapland, Finland, and Sweden. In 1873, he catalogued a coin collection at Harrow School for John Gardiner Wilkinson, the father of British Egyptology. It's interesting that that's him there. It's interesting that Harrow was the school not only of Sir Arthur Evans, but also of others closely associated with the history, archaeology, and cultural heritage of Greece and Cyprus. The 7th Lord Elgin and Lord Byron, who condemned Elgin's removal of the Parthenon marbles, both went to Harrow, as did Sinclair Hood and Gerald Cadogan, both excavators at Knossos and elsewhere in Greece and Cyprus. Also Lord William Taylor, excavator at Mycenae, and Konstantinos Levendis, whose father's cultural foundation has supported the conservation and publication of cultural heritage for decades. Returning to Evans, after graduating from Oxford with a first, he illegally excavated Roman tombs at Trier, Germany's oldest city, sending the artefacts back to Britain, before going on to Göttingen, and finally to Bosnia and Herzegovina, where he joined his brother Louis in Zagreb. They travelled through Sarajevo and Mostar to the Adriatic coast, while the Christians, mostly Serbs, were in revolt against Ottoman rule. He strongly supported the Serbs, who were the underdogs, and their goal of an independent state, and in 1876 published an account of his travels during the insurrection, which led to him being hired by the Manchester Guardian newspaper as its special Balkan correspondent, leaving for Trieste in January 1877. Evans was able to expose many of the atrocities perpetrated by the Ottoman Turks that were being ignored totally by British authorities, although all sides behaved disgracefully and inhumanely at various times. He returned to Britain and in 1878 married Margaret, eldest daughter of Edward Friedman, the British vice-consul in Bosnia. The couple returned to the Balkans and lived in Ragusa, where Evans strongly criticised the new Austrian authority of Bosnia and Herzegovina, for which he was imprisoned and finally ejected from Austria and Ragusa. In 1883, Evans and his wife visited Greece for the first time and met Heinrich Schliemann, excavator of Troy and Mycenae, and his wife Sophia in their Athenian mansion, now the Numismatic Museum. The fact that Schliemann relied on Homer to lead him to the two great cities of the Trojan War and their magnificent finds greatly impressed Evans. The following year, 1884, was the first year of Evans's formal association with archaeology, when he was made keeper of the Ashmolean Museum at the age of 34. At his inauguration, he expressed the hope that the Ashmolean would become the home of archaeology in Oxford. And so it became, and remains until this day, notable for the most important collection of prehistoric Aegean artefacts outside Greece, many donated by Evans himself in the years when duplicates were allowed to leave Greece. In addition, he later made numerous copies of Aegean artefacts that supplement original material on display. Many of the slides for this talk are taken from the guide to the new exhibition in the redeveloped Ashmolean Museum. This is from this book, The Aegean World. The Aegean material from which was largely curated by Yanis Galanakis, who has since moved to Cambridge. The title of the book, The Aegean World, a guide to the Cycladic, Minoan and Mycenaean antiquities in the Ashmolean Museum, is edited by Galanakis and authored by him, Susan Walker, Leslie Fitton of the British Museum, Susan Sherritt, John Bennett, Jack Davis, former director of the American School, and others. Returning to Evans, in 1893, his wife Margaret died of tuberculosis, and in the very next year, he began his Cretan quest. Evans had acquired Phoenician seals, as he called them, for the Ashmolean some years earlier, and bought his first seal stone in Athens in 1893, realizing that the signs engraved on some of the seals represented a hitherto unknown script whose source was Crete. They were later identified as Cretan hieroglyphic, and you see examples here on the screen. The following year, he visited the great island, still under Ottoman rule. Not only did he acquire more prehistoric seal stones, but also a relief stone vase and a gold ring, both decorated with prehistoric cult scenes that began to open up the new pre-classical world he was to inhabit and help create for the next 4 decades. He visited the Kefala Hill of Knossos for the first time on March the 15th, 1894, where earlier, in 1878, Minos Kalokerinos, the first serious investigator of Knossos, had begun excavations, recovering, among other things, painted pottery, a clay tablet inscribed with symbols quite different from hieroglyphic and later defined as the Linear B script, as well as 12 large pithoi or pithi in what was later to be called West Magazine 3 of the palace. This is the example which is in the British Museum, because Kalokerinos decided to send some of these pithoi around Europe, and I think one ended up in the Pigarini in Rome, one is in the Louvre in Paris, one in the British Museum. I'm not sure where the rest are. There's certainly at least one in the National Museum here. It's interesting that Pliny gives a description of the Cretan labyrinth, where he talks not only of winding passages, but also of doors in walls at regular intervals that lead nowhere, causing the visitor to retrace his footsteps. This could be a very good description of the West magazines of the palace, and may explain why the stratigraphy of this area has always been rather confused. In addition, according to the author Philostratus, prehistoric Knossos must also have been a tourist destination in the early 3rd century AD, since Apollonius of Tyana forbade his travelling companions to visit the site because he disapproved of King Minos. And if the Cnossian palace was a tourist attraction of the 1st to 3rd centuries AD, then it is likely that some of its walls, particularly on the west side, still protruded above the ground when Kalokerinos dug there, and even when Evans visited for the first time. The point is that Evans became interested in a site with clear and visible potential for archaeological investigation, as well as one with a wealth of myth to indicate its great importance, as Schliemann had for Troy and Mycenae. Thankfully, the archaeologists of Crete have never had to treat Cretan mythology as pseudo-historic, unlike Homeric Troy, Mycenae, Sparta, and Ithaca, to name a few, whose exploration, one might suggest, has been adversely affected by an unfortunate modern need to prove that Homer is close to history. Evans soon began negotiations to acquire a quarter of the land on which the site stood, supported by the Joseph Hatzidakis, president of the Association of Friends of Education, or Silogos. The land was bought during his next visit to Crete, 1896, but it was clear that no large-scale excavation could take place until the Ottoman authorities had been replaced. In 1898, Prince George, later a patron of the rather unsuccessful Cretan Exploration Fund, was nominated High Commissioner of Crete, and in 1899, the Antiquities Law was passed that laid the foundations for modern archaeological research in the island. The owner of a property no longer had rights over the discoveries on his land, and thus Evans was able to acquire the remainder of the Kefala Hill of Knossos with comparative ease and at a reasonable cost. It showed good foresight to purchase all this land, which was ultimately passed into the hands of the Greek state. You see on this slide in blue the very, very large area that Evans was able to purchase. Evans came out in March of 1900, still without a site director. He himself had little formal excavating experience, and D.G. Hogarth, then director of the British School of Archaeology, who might have co-directed with Evans, sensibly proposed a Scotsman, Duncan Mackenzie, who had a great deal of excavating experience, not least on one of the first stratigraphical excavations in Greece at Philakopi on the island of Milos. Both Hogarth and Mackenzie had experience working with Petrie, one of the fathers of modern archaeology, and it was probably from Petrie that Mackenzie learned how to use the association of pottery with stratigraphical layers to organize information and material and to date a site. Both Evans and Mackenzie kept detailed diaries of the excavation, but it is frequently to the Scotsman that we turn for relatively unbiased field observations. Evans was a master at putting finds in context, not only within Crete, but also within the East Mediterranean as a whole. Occasionally, however, his description of the circumstances of discovery can be influenced by what he would like them to have been, or what seemed best to fit his broad reconstruction of events. As a result, sometimes Evans's earliest observations are closer to reality than his digested account in his final publications of the site many years later. The first season concentrated on the west side of the palace, then described as Mycenaean. He suspected that there would be more storage magazines with great pithoi inside, and so it was that a row of 18 oblong rooms were uncovered, opening off the so-called Long Corridor, probably those referred to in the 1st century AD by Pliny. Among the finds were many inscribed Linear B clay tablets and seal impressions, which prompted the excavators to begin sieving the earth so that small but important fragments would be recovered. This kind of careful recovery remains impressive even to this day. On the east side of the Long Corridor, a room with a single-piece carved gypsum chair or throne and gypsum benches was found, with an adjacent sunken area later called a lustral basin, at first called Ariadne's bath. Frescoes of wingless griffins still adhered to the walls, and carved stone alabastra sat on the paved floor. You can see two of them on the right here. And here's a picture I took in 2005. The large stone basin was not found in this room at all. It was found in a corridor nearby. And here's a reconstruction of the room. Not actually an accurate reconstruction, and as I've said there, rather over-elaborate. Further south, in the area that was to be called the Central Palace Sanctuary, two small rooms or crypts were found with central pillars, inscribed with a symbol that Evans had already seen inscribed as a hieroglyphic sign on seal stones, namely the double axe. Accompanying these discoveries were thousands of kilos of fine and coarse painted and unpainted pottery. The painted pottery was at first labelled Mycenaean, as it was similar to that found in the 19th century on mainland Greece and in tombs at Ialissos on Rhodes. Evans soon used the term Minoan for both the pottery and all material culture that he uncovered at KNOSSOS, and that others were uncovering at the same time elsewhere in Crete, notably the Italians at Festos. He truly was the father of the Cretan Bronze Age. He truly was the father of Cretan Bronze Age archaeology, and the first to provide a workable stratigraphical and historical framework for all the discoveries of prehistoric Crete, beginning with the early Neolithic of KNOSSOS. Yannis Saklarakis has suggested that Evans probably lived one life as a Minoan prince. Such was his uncanny insight into Minoan Crete and into KNOSSOS in particular. Over the next 5 years, almost all of the palace, now called Minoan, was excavated, the most impressive being the residential or domestic quarter, with its spacious drainage system on the east side of the central court, where a grand staircase provided access to the hall of the colonnades and the great hall of the double axes 2 stories below. While the throne room had simply required a roof for protection, the collapsed grand staircase needed restoration so that it could once again reach up to the central court. So began Evans's most controversial works at Knossos. From the very first season, Evans had understood that conservation of the exposed remains was vital. Had he not become a very rich man after his father's death, there would have been much less intervention over the years in terms of conservation and, as he put it, reconstitution. Knossos might look more like Festos, its southern relative, were it not for Evans's wealth. His great achievement in the early years was the immediate restoration of the grand staircase and the adjoining hall of the colonnades, exposed in 1901. Further restoration followed in 1905 and 1910 and 1930. The entire residential quarter, including the great hall of the double axes shown here, reached its present form in 1930. It was after World War I that certain key areas of the palace were restored using reinforced concrete, allowing grander and more permanent solutions in order to protect the monument and give the visitor a good idea of what might once have existed. Careful thought was given to all reconstructions, the most interesting and perhaps successful becoming iconic parts of the monument, such as the north entrance passage shown here and its bastion, and the relief wall painting of a charging bull excavated in 1900 and finally restored in 1930. The throne room complex, found in the first season, saw 3 different attempts at roofing, culminating in a 2-storied concrete structure, mistakenly thought to have been influenced by Art Deco. The upper floor housing copies by Émile Gilleron of the original wall paintings that were removed to Heraclean Museum. Evans's vision of the Knossos monument was based as firmly as possible on his understanding of the excavated remains, his interpretation of the finds, including miniature frescoes depicting palatial architecture, and an unparalleled knowledge of comparative material from the East Mediterranean and further afield, a knowledge that no archaeologist today can hope to achieve. Some may still have doubts as to the validity of Evans's reconstitutions, yet as recently as November of last year, Fritz Blackolmer of the University of Vienna, and by no means a Knossos partisan, was able to give a paper at the Cretomania conference entitled "The Artistic Reception of Minoan Crete in the Period of Art Deco and Why Arthur Evans Was Right." In 1906, Evans moved into the newly built Villa Ariadne, designed by his new young architect Christian Doll, with its carefully planned Anglo-Mediterranean garden. It lay less than 100 metres from the Little Palace, a very large Minoan mansion excavated in 1905, 08 and 1910 that emulated much of the finest architecture of the palace, particularly that in the residential quarter. The Villa Ariadne became the permanent excavation residence where Evans could live in comfort and entertain in a relatively grand manner. Later, in April 1941, empty of archaeologists, it hosted King George before the flight of the royal family to Egypt as German forces overran Greece. And it was also here that the last act of World War II in Europe took place, with the signing of the surrender of the Germans on May the 9th, 1945. From the beginning of the excavation, Evans had published detailed yearly reports, including information that sometimes differed significantly from his final conclusions laid out in the monumental volumes of the Palace of Minos at Knossos. Other significant early works dealt with tombs that he excavated, including the Isopater royal tomb and a very rich cemetery contemporary with the last phases of the palace, at Zafa Papura to the northeast of the palace. Here you see some of the drawings of the tombs. These great tombs, so well published for the first time, were unparalleled elsewhere in Crete, their main parallels being in the Argolid of mainland Greece. However, in 2003, a Minoan cemetery near the law courts and partly under the 20th century AD church of Peter and Paul in Hanya was more fully excavated, leading to the discovery of chamber tombs, pit caves, and shaft graves of the kind found at KNOSSOS and in the Argolid. The form of the tombs and the wealth of the contents, so similar to those at KNOSSOS, indicate to me that as early as the 15th century BC, Hanya was the main palatial centre, balancing Knossian power in the west. And only Hanya appears to have survived as a palatial centre into the earlier 13th century BC. Perhaps Evans's most challenging discoveries at KNOSSOS were the burnt clay tablets found in the final destruction layers of the 14th century palace, and inscribed with a script called Linear B to differentiate it from the earlier and more widespread Linear A of the 17th to early 15th centuries BC. Evans made a huge contribution to the prehistory of the Aegean with his definition of three early scripts: Cretan hieroglyphic or pictographic, and Linear A and Linear B. Much of the material was published in his Scripta Minoa I from 1909 and the posthumous Volume 2, 1954. However, none of the languages could be understood before Evans's death, and only Linear B has since been deciphered by Michael Ventris, an architect who worked out that the script was Mycenaean Greek, a very archaic form of the language, probably originating on the Greek mainland. The historical consequences for the development of Aegean prehistory and history have been immense, implying that the cultural flow of the later 15th and 14th centuries was from the mainland to Crete rather than the other way around, as Evans had thought. Evans had also suggested a strong Creto-Minoan artistic element in the earlier 17th to 16th centuries BC, in the so-called militaristic shaft grave era of the Argolid. Nonetheless, a great deal could be told from the undeciphered KNOSSOS tablets, since many were clearly records of transactions and inventories of goods received, held, or sent out by the palace. The clay ceilings that go together with the tablets implied control on a large scale, with many officials involved in sometimes complex administrative practices. The seals themselves had been of gold, stone, and ivory and bone, although few actual seals were found in the palace itself. The iconography of the seal impressions, combined with pictorial scenes on wall paintings depicting processions of people, architecture, flora, not least bulls, and the relief or engraved pictorial decoration on metal, ivory, and stone objects, as well as the decoration on painted clay and faience vases, opened up a new world of prehistoric art, where nature played a major role. These aspects were the evidence for Evans's vision of a lost, peaceful, and pacifist society, which caught the imagination of the war-weary modern societies of Western Europe, apparently the descendants of this first pagan European civilization. Evans's idealistic and somewhat romantic vision of the Knossian past was in part a product of, or a reaction to, the dreadful struggles and wars of the late 19th and earlier 20th centuries AD, first in the Balkans and then throughout Europe. In his utopian society of Minoan Crete, Evans rarely invoked human agency for the destruction levels uncovered in the course of excavation. Rather, with first-hand experience of earthquakes in Crete, particularly in 1926, he often invoked earthquakes as the agencies of destruction. Indeed, he was one of the first to approach the subject of seismic destructions in a sensible and scientific manner, attempting to predict the frequency of destructive earthquakes and to project his conclusion back to the first half of the second millennium BC. Evans had spent the second half of his life devoted to Knossos and prehistoric Crete, with the interlude of World War I, when he once more engaged in Balkan politics, meeting Serbian, Croatian and Slovenian representatives in Corfu in the summer of 1917, before the founding of their kingdom, later Yugoslavia, in 1918, which was formally recognized in 1922. Evans's last excavation at Knossos was the monumental temple tomb, thought by him to have been a robbed royal burial of Knossos, where he could invoke the ghost of the ever-present King Minos. Evans never actually found a wall painting depicting a ruler in the manner of the pharaohs of Egypt. The procession fresco with the lower parts of offering bearers was found adhering to the walls of the corridor in the southwest, the so-called corridor of the procession fresco. However, the offerings were not for a ruler, as in Egypt, but rather for a goddess or priestess. Not even the faultily reconstructed Prince of the Lily Crown or Priest King relief wall painting on the right here is likely to depict a ruler, but rather two youths, one leading a sphinx, the crown belonging to the sphinx. This implies that Evans's Minoans were more than subtly different from most contemporary societies of the Eastern Mediterranean. Nonetheless, in the end, Evans imagined a ruling Minos enthroned in his council chamber as the flames of destruction brought an end to a uniquely peaceful period of human history. The date and cause of that destruction has been one of the most hotly debated questions of the last half-century, although it can almost certainly be placed somewhere in the 14th or earlier 13th centuries BC, perhaps a little earlier than the destruction in Hanya that is presently under excavation by the Archaeological Service and Swedish, and Danish excavation team. In 1935, Evans had completed the Palace of Minos and visited Crete for the last time, when a bust of the excavator, shown here, was unveiled in the West Court, witnessed by a young Stelios Alexiou, who died late last year. He spent the last 6 years of his life at Yulbury, his house in Oxford, and died peacefully a few days after his 90th birthday in 1941, in the midst of yet another world war. Thanks very much.